Hello fellow kin, welcome back to the channel and welcome to this week's competitive list review video. And a very special one at that, might I add, because this is the first competitive list analysis video since the January data slate came out, which means new points and, more importantly, new lists. On today's agenda, we'll be taking a look at the great game, Gongai GT Winter 2024 in the US, which took place on the weekend of February 3rd to the 4th, 2024. As always, we'll be looking at the Votann placing, examining the matchups, the overall scores, followed up with a deep dive into the list analysis. We'll take some time to examine the strengths and weaknesses of the list, and of course contextualize the results of the placing by looking at some of the matchups. So the list in today's video was piloted by Jonathan Sebert. This list came third place out of 34 players, taking home a 4-win, 0-draw, and 1-loss finish. Matchups included a Votann victory of 96 to Death Guard at 59, another Votann victory at 85 versus Necrons at 82, a very close game. Excited to examine this one. Votann a 71-point defeat against Chaos Knights at 88, a 74-point victory against Tyranids at 31, and a very narrow win of 91 against Duari at 90 points. Will Duari have a big impact on the meta? I do think so, and we'll maybe see if those predictions are represented in the list. Before we take a look at the list, I just want to call out that the pilot submitted his list as a Ymir conglomerate instead of Leagues of Votann, which I absolutely love. Mad respect for the little boys in red. Alright, so kicking things off, we have a Brokir Iron Master, and this guy's running the enhancement Grim Demeanor. I want to stop right here for a second and talk about this because I think it's important. So typically what we see is Grim Demeanor is taken on the Ioneer Champion because the Ioneer Champion has access to a very powerful weapon if the wounds are all capable of connecting, and this is the Mass Hammer. Because this is usually taken on the Ioneer Champion, and it's not taken for the Ioneer Champion, but it's taken on the Ioneer Champion because you benefit most with that weapon, the accompanied Ioneer Hearthguard squad is usually the main focus here. Why is that? Well, because it's a very expensive hammer unit, and it's a very powerful hammer unit if you're able to ensure that your damage connects, particularly if you're running the very commonly taken concussion gauntlets, or if you even decide to run plasma, just to make sure that you get the most amount of benefit and all of your damage goes through. Now, I mentioned this because we see something very interesting right off the bat here, and that's that the Iron Master is the one who has Grim Demeanor, which means we are not investing this onto a Hearthguard unit. And because we're not investing this onto a Hearthguard unit, which we'll see in just a moment, I think that influences how this unit was designed to be played. Now, as many of you can imagine, the Brokir Iron Master is going to be accompanying a 6-man squad of Thunderkin, and these guys are all running the Graviton Blast Cannons. This is obviously the most reliable weapon that the Brokir Thunderkin have. It's extremely effective and efficient into vehicles, but it's also quite nice as an all-rounder into anything that might be susceptible to blast, or to even just 2 damage shots, because these are strength 5. Typically, I'd be a little unsure as to the inclusion of Grim Demeanor on a Brokir Iron Master accompanying Brokir Thunderkin, instead of putting this on a bigger brick of Ioneer Hearthguard, for example, who would actually get to be in the thick of it and really look to optimize the amount of damage they're dishing out because of that sheer points cost that they're packing as a 10-man brick. But as we'll see in a little bit, there actually might not be a better recipient for this enhancement because of the way the pilot is intending to run his Ioneer Hearthguard and the role that they're going to fulfill in this list. They're actually not reliant on having Grim Demeanor, and in fact, it doesn't benefit them at all, which is really weird to say. So I think this is a really interesting choice that honestly would usually not be the correct play, but I think because you are investing points into this 6-man unit with a designated role of being the anti-tank platform for your army, I think it works. And we're going to explore this idea a little bit more as we delve deeper into the list, but just keep that in mind for now that the way that this list is designed, it is not using Hearthguard as you would typically expect. And so because of that, it logically makes sense to try to put that efficiency on the next most available target, and that would be the Brokir Thunderkin. They're honestly no joke. So off the top of my head, for some reason I was under the impression these were -1 AP. I was never a big fan of them. I've been pretty honest about this on the channel so far, but I was always under the impression they were -1 AP, but I saw they were -2 when I took a look, which was pretty impressive. I think that this makes them a little bit more viable, especially considering that if someone pops Armor of Contempt, well, now you get to ignore it. Now keep in mind, you won't ignore cover with Grim Demeanor because Grim Demeanor stipulates that it does not impact things that involve modifying your save characteristics. So in this case, Grim Demeanor does not ignore cover. So if you have vehicles that usually almost always benefit from cover, you are just natively losing one of your AP from the gun, and you can't really do anything about it. But most of these vehicles save on base 3, which means you do get to ensure if they pop some Armor of Contempt equivalent that you will at least get to push them up to a 4-up save, which means half of them should fail, and this really does go a long way in terms of helping your damage output. Next up, we have 2 Ioneer champions. Now, the first Ioneer champion is running a Darkstar Axe with a Teleport Crest. And again, I think this is also interesting. So, nothing wrong with the Darkstar Axe. I actually do think it's nice. If you're going to run 2 Ioneer champions, I actually prefer running one with Darkstar Axe as well. So, I do agree with this choice here. And then when we see something interesting is that this Ioneer champion has the Teleport Crest instead of the Weave Field Crest. Now, for those of you who don't know, the Weave Field Crest grants you the 4+ invulnerable save to your Ioneer champion versus taking the Weave Field Crest inside of your squad of Hearthguard, which would give just the Hesir access to the 4-up invulnerable save. Typically what you see is the Hesir in the list will run the Teleport Crest, and then the Ioneer champion accompanying them will take the Weave Field Crest, just so that you get more value out of your character. You know, they have more wounds, so there's more chances to save on your invuln versus with the Ioneer Hearthguard, who have only 2 wounds instead. I took some time to reflect upon why this choice might have been made, and because if we look at the second Ioneer champion, which we'll talk about in a little bit, this one is actually running Weave Field, which means it was intentional to run Teleport on the Ioneer champion. The only thing I could think of was that by having the Teleport taken on the champion and the Hesir taking the 4+ invulnerable save, you might find yourself in a situation where you actually wind up getting a little bit more value out of it, because the unit you care about the most here are the Hearthguard. The champion is nice, he's strong, he does his damage, he's okay, but we really care about keeping the Ioneer Hearthguard squad as full and alive and healthy as possible, just to make the most amount of use out of that incredible damage potential. So maybe taking the Weave Field Crest on the Hesir in this case is deliberate, because what we're trying to do is actually just gamble that we'll be able to keep our Ioneer Hearthguard squad alive longer, because when damage comes through, you first have to allocate it to the bodyguard unit, which means you're going to be losing your Ioneer Hearthguard pretty quickly if you don't have that invul save and anything is pushing them beyond it, versus saving that durability for your champion, who would be the last one left alive. In this case, I think the pilot is trying to just get more value out of the Hearthguard unit, and I do think it's an interesting choice overall. By taking the Teleport Crest on the Ioneer champion that accompanies them, you still get that flexibility of being able to either deploy this unit in Deep Strike or on the table inside of a Hecaton Land Fortress, which we'll look at in a little bit. Overall, a very interesting choice, not one that I've ever considered, and I do think it's worth exploring. I'd be curious to ask the pilot how he felt this performed on the table, and if he wishes that he had that extra durability for the Ioneer champion instead, because it just didn't work out with the Ioneer Hearthguard to survive any dedicated fire, or if he actually felt that this provided him with an extra turn or an extra activation of shooting. The third character in this list is another Ioneer champion, and this one is taking the enhancement Appraising Glare. Appraising Glare is a pretty okay enhancement, there's nothing wrong with it. It gives you a little bit extra token generation on the board, which is always nice. Being able to pick a point on the table where an objective marker is and say, okay, anything on this is going to be +1 to hit, or if they already have 1 token, just increasing that to +1 to wound, is always really, really powerful and nice. Especially considering that this is a relatively mobile list in terms of hammer units, and so we want to be able to get around the board in various positions and be able to have pretty good damage output into whatever we target. Now, unlike the first champion, this guy is actually running the Mass Hammer, and he's running the Weave Field. So here, we're trying to get that 4-up invulnerable save on our character, and we're running him with a much heavier hitting weapon. Typically, this is where we would see the Grim Demeanor enhancement being selected, because we want to make sure that that hammer, which, you know, it's okay, it's just a hammer, but what it does is have the potential to spike quite high. So by building in some kind of contingency to ensure that that damage goes through, if it does roll well, we want it to connect. His Hearthguard squad that he's accompanying is the same loadout as the first, and we'll touch upon that in a second. But for the Hesir in particular, we see that this one is also running a Weave Field Crest, which means we've built in some added durability redundancy with this unit, and it's dedicated for this role. This squad will always start on the table, always in a land fort, and there's a 4-up invuln to get through in the squad on that Hesir. And then once you get through all the units, you have a 4-up invuln to get through on the champion. I quite like this option of having a flexible deployment. You have the potential to start both squads on the table, or depending on matchup, you could bring one squad up into Deep Strike instead. For troops, we're looking at 2 squads of 10 Hearthkin Warriors. I'm a big fan of running Hearthkin Warriors, and I mentioned it a few times that I'm a little disappointed they didn't come down in points to offset the cost of the Sagittars going up. I think it would have been nice to see more of them on the table because they're really, really useful in my opinion, and I'm happy to see 2 of them make it into this list. In terms of loadouts, these guys are all running the same thing. The typical plasma pistol on the Thane, full house for the war gear upgrades, and they're all running ions instead of the bolters, with a magma rail and an L7 missile launcher in each. Now, this is a unit that is used to score points. It doesn't really matter too much what weapons you run on them. It can have a very small impact, but overall, you're throwing these guys out quite early to try to score you some objectives, try to sticky something for you, or just score a secondary somewhere as well, or even set up an early trade. That said, I'm personally a fan of taking the assault gun on one of my Hearthkin Warriors per squad. I think this is a very useful weapon because it's a slight tech choice in that you get to actually advance and still be eligible to do most of the secondary actions that would require to be eligible to shoot. And conversely, without running the assault gun, this means you're a little slower. You can't really rely on your advance rolls to get to somewhere if that extra 1 or 2 inches is all you needed to be able to score a secondary. I do think the damage is negligible on these guys, so it doesn't really matter what you run. In that case, I feel there's really no reason not to take the assault gun, but maybe with a list like this where we're only running 2 Sagittars, we do want to have some extra reliability with anti-tank, and that comes through the form of these warriors, which might be able to do some slight damage. On that note, we're running only 2 Sagittars in this list, something that's not seen very often, if at all. We saw for LVO pre-dataslate that all the top lists were running 3 Sagittars instead, maybe in anticipation of the points going up and wanting to try to adapt to the meta early on, or just trying to surprise people and deviate away from that 6 or 4 to 6 Sagittar archetype that was going around for the entire season. That said, 2 is a very bold and interesting choice, and it's also worth knowing that he chose high las, which we typically see when you're running 4 or more Sagittars because we want to rely on some of that variance that's averaged out with the inclusion of several potential high-hitting shots. But in this case, he does not go for the reliable 3 damage from the missile launcher. He instead opts for that randomness from the high las. And I do think this is mostly because we have the Brokir Thunderkin who can support and dedicatedly kill any high toughness vehicle threat that's on the table pretty reliably. And so the Sagittars are here to provide some supporting fire and also just potentially pick something up if they spike. I'm curious to see if we'll be seeing a decrease in Sagittars taken. I do expect people will stop running 6, that's for sure. But I wonder what the new minimum will be because it's still objectively a very powerful tool to have with the forward scout. Just allows you to set up scoring really early on in the game, which is quite oppressive. Before we talk about the land fort, I want to quickly touch upon the Chthonian Berserks in this list. So here we have 2 squads of 5 Berserks. One squad is running 5 Mauls and a Mole Grenade Launcher, and the second squad is running 5 Plasma Axes instead, with the addition of the Mole Grenade Launcher. This is pretty interesting as well. Typically we'll see squads of Mauls being included because these guys swing quite high for their points cost. I mean, they are still 100 points for 5, and they die quite quickly. They're a little bit unreliable to get into combat, but if they do connect, you can reliably do some pretty decent damage and punch up above your point bracket. I can appreciate the inclusion of the Plasma Axe squad. I don't think there's anything wrong with these guys, and they definitely have good play into some elite or infantry heavy lists that aren't running too many vehicles. I also think they complement this list quite nicely because you do have some dedicated shooting that's going to take care of any high toughness threats. But conversely, maybe you want to have something that you can keep backfield just in case you have some infiltrators or you have something that aggressively or quickly pushes towards your backfield. Maybe, Duari, for example, which is going to become a prominent meta figure. So I think having access to medium to lower strength weapons, but just massive attacks is really helpful to make sure that you can clear any threat that pushes a little too aggressively towards your backfield. To finish our talk about the Ioneer Hearthguard, these guys are also running a not so common build. We do see, again, the classic Kassir with the Concussion Hammer, which is objectively the best choice. They're also running all Vulcanites, which I do think are quite nice, especially coming out of a land fort, because you get that re-roll to fish for more devs. And if you're interested to see what this could look like on paper, I have a video that I covered last week about the unit analysis for the Ioneer Hearthguard, and I do cover the math in that video there, showing how effective the damage could be coming out of a land fort when you are running Vulcanites. So nothing too crazy on this side. Where things do get a shake up is what we see for the melee weapons, and instead of taking the classic concussion gauntlets across all units, we see both squads are taking plasma blades, which for me is very surprising to see. I do feel like the math supports that the plasma blade is considerably less effective than the concussion gauntlets, really only having a significant impact when you're targeting something that's one wound or a very low toughness. So I can't help but feel that with the data slate coming out, maybe people are considering what some of the new meta threats could be. I know there's been a shift with Duari players focusing on more low toughness infantry units in their lists. Likewise, there's a rise of Duari now, who are quite a light toughness but very quick mobile army. So maybe there's some considerations on this side as well. Knights did get a slight nerf for the most part. I'd say there was a buff to Imperial Knights, but it wasn't that substantial that I think they're going to be making a huge dent on the meta. So perhaps there's a swap to move away from that really heavy, dedicated anti-elite melee on these guys, and instead focus on having something that is a little better into infantry, just in case the meta decides to prioritize an environment where light infantry is rampant on the table. Again, I said this a couple times, and maybe I'm completely wrong, but I do feel like this list plays quite well into Duari because they want to get into your face early game and hold you back. And so with an army like this, I feel like you can afford to stay back for a turn and then disembark from your transports if they survive and clean up whatever's in the way, which again lends credit to the loadouts that we discussed, selected here on both the Chthonian Berserks and the Ioneer Hearthguard, where we prioritize those lighter toughness targets. Now, last but not least, we have 2 squads of 3 humble pioneers. These guys are quite essential in any list if you plan on scoring points. I think they're just very good units to have. They're extremely mobile, they're extremely flexible because you get to pop them up and back down every turn, and you get to just go wherever you need to be, and by extension, just pick up a lot of easy secondaries. Next up, we have the 2 land fortresses that I mentioned a little bit earlier. So these guys are running my preferred loadout, being the SP conversion beamers and the pan-spectral scanner with twin bolt cannons. I think this is probably the optimal loadout, and I'm excited to run a unit analysis video on these soon, just to confirm that in review. But I do feel confident that this is a very strong loadout. We're seeing it week after week. It's reliable, it's efficient, it has a potential to spike, but it is quite stable in terms of output, whether or not you do end up rolling hot on the conversion shots. Now, I want to call out a unique interaction we see in this list, which I think is always very creative and nice, and that's that for deployment, we have several options. We will always be running one squad of Ioneer Hearthguard, the squad that has no teleport crest, inside of one of the land forts. This is a pretty staple situation that we see. He opted for more durability in light of removing some of that flexibility with the teleportation crest. Nothing wrong with that if you're dedicatedly planning on having this unit be on the table no matter what matchup you're in, and I think that this is fine and it's a very valid choice. For the second land fort, we have some interesting decisions to make. So depending on the matchup that we're in, we might opt to put either the 5-man Hearthguard with the other Ioneer champion inside, of course, or we could put these guys into Deep Strike and instead load up with one of the 5-man Chthonian Berserk squads, these being either the Mauls or the Plasma Axes. So now we've added an extra layer of flexibility. We not only are deciding what squad gets to ride inside of our Hekaton land fort at the beginning of the game, we also decide what loadout it's going to be equipped with. So we really have this almost jack of all trades kind of approach here for deployment, with this one unit acting as almost a Swiss Army knife, if you'd like to think about it like that. If you're maybe facing some kind of elite threat that doesn't have a good invuln save, maybe we'll put the 5-man Berserk squad with Mauls inside and just be ready to stage and prime a nice assault on that target and punch up in points. Likewise, this could even work with something maybe like a heavier elite infantry unit. Conversely, we might be up against something that's a little more hoardy on the table, and because of that, we might want to run the Plasma Axes instead. Maybe there is no threat to our backfield, and so in this case, we could afford to put our Berserks for the Plasma Axes inside of the land fort, move them up, and get ready to just clear a bunch of bodies off of the center of the table. Lastly, if we need something a little more dynamic and flexible, we just put the Ioneer Hearthguard squad in. Maybe there's no need for us to deep strike. We just put these guys inside of the land fort, we run them up mid, they get out, and they could hold that center objective and be a pretty good threat into most targets. Overall, I really like a decision like this in list design. I think it's extremely creative, and the pilot has clearly shown that it works quite well. Now, I obviously just assumed the matchup types and where you would maybe want to pick one squad or the other, but I would love to hear from the pilot myself and just find out how he felt this setup worked in his games, and if there were particular situations that warranted one over the other. I think there are some very clear and strong strengths to this list, the first one being that it's extremely powerful into light or medium toughness armies. Picture things such as Infantry Duari, or Immortals from Necrons, or Drukhari, and even Tyranids. I think this army is extremely powerful into lists like that because it allows you to just capitalize on the skew into being able to kill as many of those light to medium infantry targets as possible. Another good strength is that there are some very solid redundancies, basically across the entire list if you think about it. We're running 2 of everything, except for the Brokir Thunderkin. This is quite nice, because if you lose one, it's not over because you have a second one that could complete the job. This is always really good and a very strong tool to use for list building because it allows you to threat overload your opponent and need them to dedicatedly target one thing at a time to pick it up, because you'll always have the threat of double efficiency present on the table. So I think it's always really impactful when you're able to include some kind of redundancy like this, and here we see the pilot was able to incorporate that nearly across the entirety of his list. Double redundancy here for troop scoring, double redundancy for transport, for land forts, for Hearthguard, and for the Berserks as well, which is quite nice. On the topic of redundancy with the troops, we see there's very good mission play with this list because we're able to have essentially 4 squads of 5 troops present on the table, ready to go across on each quadrant and score secondaries as necessary. In addition to, of course, utilizing the scout move of the Sagittar itself. Additionally, with access to 2 of these 3-man squads of bikes, you get to very reliably jump back up into reserves and come back down on a table edge, basically every turn. Another very good strength to this list is the flexible deployment, and we spoke about that a lot while we were looking at the list analysis, but I just want to touch back on it again real quick and say that it is very impactful when you're able to come to a table with a list and flexibly determine how you want to deploy your army in face of whatever units your enemy is playing or whatever army you're playing against. Because sometimes you do wish you had that option to change something very slight, even if it's just a matter of, oh, I wish I had this loadout instead. By building flexibility into your roster, such as we see here in this really great example, we're able to sort of bake in that ability to set ourselves up for success very early on. All that said, I think there are some pretty clear weaknesses as well to a list such as this, and the main one is that it feels like it just lacks a lot of dedicated anti-tank shooting. Sure, we have the 6-man Brokir Thunderkin squad that's fully decked out with an enhancement, but it's still just one unit, and you're quite reliant on coming out of reserves because there's absolutely no way you walk that unit up the board with 5-inch move without the ability to even advance and shoot. It's just not worth doing. I'd also imagine that if you are able to come in from reserves without being screened out and you shoot at whatever target you're aiming for, once you're done your activation and it's your opponent's turn, you're probably going to end up losing a good chunk of that unit. And sure, there's some built-in protection with the ECOGs and the assistant, but I still think you're looking to lose some units if the opponent is trying to dedicatedly take out that target. You also only have 2 Sagittars with anti-tank built into them, which means sure, you could spike and do some nice damage, but Sagittars are typically going to be prioritized, especially if you're using them to try to scout out of your deployment zone early game and set yourself up for some nice secondary or primary scoring. I think that they're pretty easy targets for your opponent. They're not that durable. Now for the Hecaton, the Hecaton does obviously have anti-tank play, especially if there's 2 judgment tokens on a target, but keep in mind it's still only strength 10 for the shooting, so this is a pretty significant bracket. I'll add that another weakness to this army, and I put a question mark here because I'm not really sure if it is a weakness, but it just feels like a very reactive army to play. I don't know if that's a bad thing, but I think it's worth calling out. The list feels like it plays best when the pilot knows what he should be doing as a response to what his opponent is actually doing on the table. So, for example, the deployment, right? That's the easiest example for us to look at. Depending on what your opponent does, you know how you should be deploying and using your units. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. I don't think it's bad. I just think it's an interesting weakness that you're sort of almost relying on how your opponent plays to effectively operate the list, which is cool. But I don't know if it's a weakness. So I put a question mark here. I don't know. What do you guys think? I wrote here that it also feels too heavy into anti-light infantry. That's obviously, as you can expect, if you're lacking dedicated anti-tank, you're going to be supplying that damage somewhere else instead. And I think maybe we are a little heavy into anti-light. Is the pilot maybe expecting the meta to take shape into lower toughness targets? I'm not entirely sure. I'd be curious to hear his reasoning, especially for the Plasma Blade Hearthguard. I'm super curious to know why both squads are running this, and if he felt at any point that he would have preferred to have taken the Concussion Gauntlets instead. The last negative I'll mention here is I feel personally that there's too few Thunderkin. I know that they got a points increase and it's a lot harder for us to run as many things as we wanted before because most lists are up around 115 points, which is pretty significant. But I feel like we saw with the LVO lists, the more Thunderkins you have, I guess it's one of those units where the more you have, the better it'll perform. But if you only run one squad, because it's so variable, you might be disappointed in its output. I'm just personally, I'm still very torn on as to whether I like these guys or not. They're undeniably very oppressive with their shooting, and it's something your opponent has to always keep in mind. But I don't know if I like one squad of 6 or if I would prefer having 2 squads of 6 or even just one squad of 6 and one squad of 3, which honestly could work pretty well in this list because you'd be able to have even more flexibility with deployment by putting that squad of 3 in the land fort instead. If maybe there were more vehicles in your opponent's list and you needed to get those Thunderkin to the middle of the board as quickly as possible. Just something interesting to consider, and I'd love to hear the pilot's thoughts on this. So after recording the audio for this, I kind of just thought about it for a bit, and I'm not really sure if I'm happy with categorizing the list being reactive as a weakness because I actually don't think it is. It's actually probably more of a strength, but it's just a weird consideration to have because I feel like the list is so reliant on capitalizing on what your opponent does versus having a game plan going into it. So I'm not too sure if I'm happy with putting this as a weakness. I think it could work as both a weakness and a strength. So I'll leave this one up to you guys to decide. I just think it's a very interesting consideration. You'll notice I added a pie chart here to this slide, and it's not something new. My other videos also had one, but the content of the pie chart is what's actually new. So I don't think they were actually all that useful. I was just sort of putting visualization on the screen just to have visualization, to be honest with you. But I think something that is more helpful is instead of identifying what types of units were taken in terms of vehicles versus troops, I think a breakdown of unit roles is going to actually be a lot more helpful and useful when we look at these analyses videos. So by that I mean, I'm basing this off of the 4-quadrant theory. I didn't make this theory up, so I can't take credit for it. It's just something that's been going around from a few years ago, actually, when I first started learning about list design and things like that. I think the original person I saw it from was a YouTuber named Daniel Brewster. I actually really liked the video and the content, and he basically just talks about how every unit has its own designated role, and when you're building a list, it's just a matter of balancing what each unit is designed to do when putting it in that list so it has a very clear purpose. And so what I did is I basically broke the points down here for you to see that in this list, I would say there's 400 points dedicated to secondaries, and so this takes the shape of basically your 2 troop choices with the addition of the 2 pioneer squads. You also have 225 points dedicated to support, and in this instance I decided to put these as just the characters, including their enhancements. I feel like this is a good representation of the idea behind a support token. It's really just to enhance the output or the efficiency of another one of your key units that's included in the list. So I think that this makes sense at 225. And then for trading pieces, I decided to include here your 2 squads of Berserks, because these guys are basically here just to help trade, and included the unit of Thunderkin, because this as well will likely just be used as a trading piece and not something you're relying on to score primary. The rest of the list consisting of the Sagittars, the Hearthguard, and the 2 Hecaton land forts, I would consider as primary focused. So this being that you're bringing these 2 objectives, they are obviously doing damage. The goal is to trade with these and trade well, but their real purpose here is to have something very strong in your list that is good at taking primary, keeping primary, denying your opponent primary, and just scoring it for you. So I'm not sure if this is more useful than just listing what's in the list in the pie chart. I think personally it is. It could be something that's interesting to explore going forward as we see different lists and compare how well they placed inside of a tournament. Is there a better ratio for Votann that works with something like this? So I did decide to put this here. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. All right, let's take a look at some of these matchups and help contextualize the placing. So game one was against Death Guard here, and what we see is a pretty nice victory of 96 to 59. This doesn't really surprise me. I know that Death Guard started having some pretty good placements before the data slate came out, and most of them were running some combination of allied Chaos Knights and allied Chaos Demons. There were some slight changes to this with the data slate, but generally I think most lists are going to basically be running the same stuff they were already running before, because there weren't that many significant updates that happened with their points. Just, Terminators mostly came down, and one of their characters came down as well. So what I think this ends up looking like is you have the Death Guard player probably running a lot of Plague Marines with Rhinos, and Votann plays exceptionally well into lists like that because they are individuals that are low to medium toughness, and they don't actually have invulnerable saves, which is really, really good. Particularly for this list, because we are actually teching and leaning a little bit more heavily into light and medium toughness killing targets. And I would imagine we have a pretty easy time popping open a Rhino and picking up whatever comes out of it. There's also some added flexibility here with the Broke Your Thunderkin being able to shoot into either high toughness targets, or if they want, even put everything into Plague Marine squads of 10, because you're going to have access to blast, you're still strength 5, and you are 2 damage apiece, meaning you will make a dent on this unit. Overall, I think Death Guard is a little bit slower than Votann, surprisingly, so I think Votann comes out on top of this, just being able to lean a little bit heavier into scoring secondaries with your Warriors and your Pioneers, while the main bulk of your force is able to contest the center of the table and basically just pick apart the enemy's army. Next up into Necrons, a little bit more of an interesting game here as we see the score is quite close at 85 to 82. I mentioned that this list would play pretty well into low toughness 1 wound models such as Immortals, and I still stand by that. I think this was pretty impactful here, and I know some of you might be wondering, well, what about Catan shards? How do you deal with them if you're not running any high damage weaponry? I actually think we handle them quite nicely. And if you watched my other video where we did a Hearthguard unit analysis, you'll recognize that the loadout used here, predominantly with the Vulcanites and the Hecaton Land Fortress, is pretty significant in terms of being able to do a serious dent into any Catan shard that gets too close to you. Mainly because you get to fish for those devastating wounds, and you don't actually need to run Grim Demeanor because you're only damage 1 anyway, so your damage won't be halved. I still think it would be nice to have access to the damage 2 weapons here for melee, simply because if you do need to make a charge, it does make a big difference doubling your damage. But again, without access to Grim Demeanor on the squad, maybe it's a little less efficient. I wonder how he felt that his Thunderkin performed, because a lot of the units that we see with Necrons are actually medium toughness with access to a 4++, which makes them surprisingly annoying. I'd imagine if you're playing into something like Canoptic Court, which turns off the ability to shoot when you're outside of 12, or maybe even the detachment where you could teleport across the board, I feel like you kind of take advantage of the low mobility of the Thunderkin squad, simply because once you move, we can't catch you. Overall, it was a very close game in this push for the center of the table, and I'm happy to see Votann take the lead, if by just a slight margin. Game 3, Votann into Chaos Knights. It's a little bit closer than I would have thought it went. I discussed in the weaknesses section of the video that I felt the list lacked dedicated anti-tank shooting, and I would feel like this would be most prominent in a matchup into Chaos Knights, or just Knights in general. But what we see with this match is that the Chaos Knight player actually just took an entire roster of baby Knights, so those little brigands. And I actually think this helps quite a bit. They're still T10, but I mean, your Hecaton at this point is going to be wounding natively on 4s anyway, and if they're double judged, you'll go down to a 3, which is probably as good as it's going to get into a Knight army. Likewise, your Thunderkin here are going to do some nice work, as each Brigand is sitting on 12 wounds with a 5-up invuln, which isn't going to impact the minus AP from their shots, hopefully allowing for some consistent damage to come through, picking up a Brigand per activation. I'd be curious to run the math on this, and I'll probably do it for one of the examples in the Broke Your Thunderkin unit analysis video when I get to that. Overall, I'm not entirely shocked at the defeat here, but I do think it was a little closer than I would have thought it had gone. I'm guessing what happened was that the Votann player had some really good early game aggro on the table, allowing him to get in certain places with his scout moves and his ability to score secondaries pretty easily with the Hearthkin Warriors and the Pioneers. But I think eventually what happened is that he just kind of lost a couple of key units that were the only reliable anti-tank threats in his list. And the Hearthguard, while they still do some damage with their devs, I really feel like not having access to the 2 damage weapons hurts a lot in this particular matchup. I won't spend too much time on Votann into Tyranids because I feel like the list is pretty self-explanatory as to why it would perform so well. You have great scoring, objectively, so that's fine. And then your killing is exceptionally skewed, in my opinion, towards lower toughness targets and medium toughness targets, which is basically what Tyranids typically run. So you'll be able to outscore, you'll be able to outkill, and you'll be able to hold the middle a lot more reliably than they would. So I do think that this list plays very, very strong into Tyranids. I'm not sure what the Tyranid player was running, but I think we can generalize it enough to assume that there were a few big monster units on the table, coupled with significantly large bodies of chaff or swarms like gargoyles, for example. And I think this list does extremely well against that, right? Because natively, you're skewed into anti-infantry and low toughness, which means you don't actually need judgment token support on those targets. So what you do is you put your judgment support targets on the giant monsters that are present on the table, just to help amplify your damage output and ensure that you're able to somewhat get a bonus into killing them. And maybe it's just enough with the 2 Hecatons and the 2 Sagittars, while the rest of your army pretty easily picks up the lower toughness, high model count units. Alright, last but not least is the one I'm most excited for, and this is Drukhari. So we have literally a 1-point victory advantage against Drukhari, so 91 to 90 points. That's how close it was. And I think this is the army everybody is curious about. They got the new detachment that came out for them, and it's honestly really, really fun. If you have a chance to read the rules, I strongly recommend you do so. It's a lot of movement shenanigans with your transports and just optimizing transports in a list to get the most amount of value out of every other unit that comes out of them or interacts with them. It's really cool and it's really well designed. So I didn't really have a lot of experience with Drukhari, but I did a bunch of research before making this video. And the general playstyle, from my understanding, is that you want to be hyper aggressive early game and send out your units in waves. So what you're trying to do is keep your opponent in their deployment zone as long as possible, just throwing things at them. And you're able to do so and do so well because you are so fast, you are so mobile, and you're surprisingly resilient, and you do a lot of damage in melee too. So when you do connect something, you're not just throwing Cadian guards at them to try to stall and get through the bodies. You're actually throwing these cheap units that are pretty decent melee threats, and they'll get through to you. There's also Scourges, which do a lot of damage to vehicles, and are, in my opinion, are going to be a staple in most lists. And I would imagine on paper, most Votann lists would have a difficult time dealing with Drukhari in the current state. But I think that this list comes out on top, just barely, because they decided to skew into that lower toughness, lighter infantry, medium infantry targets in terms of killing potential. And in a lot of ways, you're kind of able to mimic the tempo of the Drukhari army. And I mentioned this as a possible weakness in the video, but I think in this case it might be a strength. You're able to be a little more responsive and reactive to what the Drukhari player does because you have those built-in redundancies and because your list is designed to play well into such a skew. So I think this was a pretty interesting game to play out, and it must have been a very, very tense game of essentially trying to balance between reactivity and aggressiveness with your scorers and knowing how and if you should push towards the center of the board and how to control that area while Drukhari is sending in waves of effective and very strong melee units at you. I do think that the Broker Thunderkin are probably pretty good in this matchup because they get to, I would say, consistently and reliably kill the medium toughness units of Drukhari because they just don't have that many wounds on most of their vehicles that they take. And your plasma gauntlets here for your Hearthguard are likewise going to have a huge impact because you're able to actually trade pretty well into that designated target. If you look at my other video for the unit analysis, you'll see that most of the targets that you would be hitting into Drukhari are actually very appropriate targets for that weapon profile, which means you sort of optimize your value here in this case. Overall, it looks like it was a very tight game, and I would love to be able to watch a replay of this match, just so I could learn a little bit more as to how this list plays exactly when it's faced with a threat that's extremely aggressive and fast. Alright, so wrapping the video up, I just want to give another big congratulations to Jonathan Serbert here, who came third place, and commend him on being one of, I guess, the very first innovators of the new dataslate meta that was able to play so well at this event. There were a lot of interesting considerations that were made in the list design here, and it's not something we've seen very often, as with most typical archetypes that we examined before the dataslate came out. So I'm curious to see how the meta takes shape and what kind of Votann lists end up coming out on top. As always, thank you guys so much for watching. If you like this kind of content, please do hit that subscribe button and give it a thumbs up. Leave me a comment down below. I always try to answer as many as I can, and I love hearing your thoughts on everything I cover. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll catch you all in the next one.